It is my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. J. Bregman, Professor Emeritus of History and Religious Studies at the University of Maine, member of the Board of Directors of the International Society for Neoplatonic Studies, who has written on Neoplatonism, religious syncretism, and conflict of religious ideologies in late antiquity, especially as reflected in the work of Synesius of Cyrene, an intellectual Hellenic Neoplatonist who, with Platonic reservations, became a Christian bishop, and the Emperor Julian, who rejected his early Christian education and became a convert to the Theurgic Hellenic Neoplatonism of Iamblichus, the ideology of his anti-Christian reign. As a graduate student, Dr. Bregman discovered the works of that Romantic era advocate of Julian's religion, Thomas Taylor, as his American disciplines. He also studies that literature, principally the work of later American transcendentalist Thomas More Johnson and his friends. And Dr. Bregman is going to talk about Thomas More Johnson and Alexander Wilder as proponents of Thomas Taylor-inspired Neoplatonic revival. Johnson emphasized the logical analysis of Neoplatonic metaphysics, Wilder and Neoplatonic syncretism of all religions. So in a sense, they were proponents of different approaches to the same worldview. Dr. Bregman.
It's higher dymos, material dymos. Okay, I was prepared. Okay. Now, I'd like to thank Dr. Poutou and everybody at Missouri State for this invitation, and also the opportunity to visit the Johnson Library Museum, which I wanted to do for a long time. Actually, this paper was slightly different before lunch today. When discussions at lunch plus the papers and discussions and informal discussions led me to make some changes. So hopefully that works. And if I stumble a little here and there, it's probably I scribbled and changed a few things. Okay. You can hear me all right? Okay. My own discovery of Thomas Taylor was mutatis mutandis, not unlike Thomas N. Johnson. In graduate school at Yale, while working on the Emperor Julian and Synesius of Cyrene, I came upon a volume, Thomas Taylor, the Platonists, edited by Kathleen Rainey and George Mills Harper. I read Harper's article on Thomas Taylor in America and learned about TMJ. Alexander Wilder, A.W., and others who attempted to continue Taylor's work. I also found T.T. publications in the Rare Book Library, including the amazing 7th volume of the Platonic Theology, which he wrote himself. The original was lost. So if you believe in reincarnation. Subsequently, I read issues of the Platonist and decided then that I would research and write on North American Neoplatonism. While teaching at UC Berkeley, I read T.T. My friend and colleague and great expert on Iamblichus, this was a long time ago, John Dillon, saw me reading him and told me that T.T. was not much of an original thinker, just hooked on Neoplatonism. Since he moved from Cal and accepted the chair of Regis Professor of Greek at Trinity College, Dublin, he has changed his mind. He is now a trustee of the Prometheus Trust, the UK Thomas Taylor Society, led by Tim Addy. And by the way, Tim thinks TMJ is the American Thomas Taylor. I left Berkeley for a more secure teaching position at Maine. The Cal Classics chair told me I would be lucky to work with Ronald B. Levinson, a world-renowned Plato scholar whose thesis was on TT, and whose defense of Plato was considered a major contribution to Platonic scholarship. Driving across country, I made it a priority to stop at the University of Missouri-Columbia and Xerox as much TMJ as possible. That was in the technologically primitive mid-1970s. When I arrived in Maine, I found out that unfortunately Levinson was in a nursing home suffering from advanced Parkinson's. Colleagues were reading to him aloud Plato's dialogue on the immortality of the soul, the Phaedon. I have been, however, able to work with his books and special collections, including his thesis on Taylor and volumes of TTs that belong to, for example, Bronson Alcott and Bronson Alcott's biographer, the St. Louis Hegelian F.B. Sanborn, and also issues of the Platonist and other materials. Okay. According to William Ellery Channing, a contemporary, Transcendentalism was in part a reaction against Puritan orthodoxy, in part an effect of renewed study of the ancients or Oriental pantheists, of Plato and the Alexandrians and co., and the somewhat stunted stock of Unitarianism had been grafted German idealism. The result was a vague yet exalting conception of the godlike nature of the human spirit. Many passages in Emerson's notebooks attest to his readings in Plotinus and Neoplatonists. For example, in Platinian mode, there is no chance and no anarchy of the universe. All is system and gradation. Every god is there sitting in his sphere. The young mortal enters the firmament. There he is alone with them alone, they pouring on him benedictions and gifts and beckoning him up to their thrones. On the instant and incessantly fall snowstorms of illusions. Every moment new changes and new showers of deceptions to baffle and distract him. And when by and by, for an instant the air clears and the cloud lifts a little, there are the gods sitting around him on their thrones, they alone with him alone. Inspired by Emerson, Alcott, and the Neoplatonic guru T.T., late 19th century group of American Neoplatonists became proponents of a revival as an antidote to the perceived rise of atheism, materialism, and hedonism. T.T. thought the Emperor Julian was a good Neoplatonist, though not of the caliber of Plato, Pythagoras, and Proclus. He is in complete sympathy with the Emperor's sacred mission, quote, to restore a religion which is co-evil with the universe. In order to explicate Julian's description of the efficacy of the image of Cybele upon her arrival at Rome, T.T. noted his friend Sallust's theory of statues, designed according to divine imitation and similitude. He contrasted this sharply to the false theory of images of saints, the former being beautifully pious, the latter impious, full of delusion. Taylor admired Synesius the Hellene, but never quite forgave him for his conversion to Christianity. He translated his non-Christian work on Providence, though he refused to translate his Christianizing hymns. Hymn to Jupiter by T.T. is admittedly and demonstrably inspired by Synesius' metaphysical poetics. T.T.'s North American disciples were not, in that way, rote followers. They promoted later Neoplatonism as the true divine philosophy, yet they acknowledged Christianity as part of a syncretistic synthesis, esoterically in agreement with Platonism, as were all religions. A. Bronson Alcott followed T.T. in valuing Pythagoras as the guide for practical life, and Plotinus as the delineator of celestial unfallen man. He called Taylor an exotic transplanted from Alexandrian gardens. Thomas M. Johnson, then of Osceola, Missouri, a Notre Dame graduate trained in Latin and Greek, began a correspondence with Bronson Alcott in 1874, in which he stated his adherence to transcendental Neoplatonism. He said to Alcott, after a diligent study of Plotinus, Proclus, Julian, Taylor, etc., I consider myself qualified to explain the dogmas of Plato and his disciples. So he wasn't shy. Alcott encouraged him to include the work of T.T., and he concurred, that is, T.M.J. concurred with T.T. and sided with late antique historians in expressing horror at fanatic Christian crimes and atrocities. When T.M.J. wrote a pro-Julian, anti-Constantine piece entitled Julian, one Reverend B.F. Tetz attacked it. And, quote the Reverend, to our mind, the later transcendentalist that is, are such Christians as the Emperor Julian was after he renounced Christianity. Only these later pagans have not the imperial apostate's honesty to tell the world plainly that their religion is simply the old-time pagan infidelity revived. But unlike TMJ translated at least a couple of Synesius hymns, hymn 1, which is really purely Platinian, Porphyrian, and maybe influenced by the Chaldean oracles, show an appreciation for this Neoplatonic outlook, and his imagery is Neoplatonic Chaldean. Enes hedanon, monos monadon, of unities, the sacred unity of monads, the primeval monad, uniting simplicities of the highest, and being generated by superessential throes, whence issuing forth through his firstborn form, unity was diffused in a manner ineffable and received a threefold energy. And as the superessential fount is crowned with the beauty of offspring which emanates from the center and around the center revolved. TMJ understood Synesius' poetical description of how the one, manifesting through first generated form, that is intellect, or the Neoplatonic hypothesis of nous, initiates metaphysical procession and return, proodos and epistrophe. And from hymn 5, beyond the blessed silence conceals the division, yet ever indivisible, of intellectual and intelligible natures. There is one fount and one root shining forth in a triple form of light. Silence, or side in Greek, from one fountain and one root, is the Chaldean oracle's transcendent silence of the paternal depth. The distinction between intellectual and intelligible refers to the Platonic ideas as respectively active thoughts and eternal objects of thought. The final lines depict the one's immediate manifestation as the first intelligible triad. The one, its power, and its intellect. Now, in the following lines, TMJ brings out Synesius' unique syncretistic blend of Chaldean Orphic with Christian imagery, where abides the profoundly paternal, there likewise is found the glorious Son, offspring of his inmost essence, and the world-creative wisdom, and of the Holy Spirit shineth forth the light which bindeth all in one. From one fountain and one root comes the abundance of all goods. Soon after his Neoplatonic initiation, TMJ began to translate Plotinus. Among his translations, we show a grasp of the material of Ennead 1:1 and 4:1 on the soul. Those translations of the first Plotinus actually to appear in English. Alexander Wilder, A.W., interested in comparative religion, surveyed the school of Alexandria, a branch of which, planted at Athens, had Proclus as its chief luminary. He who made a bold attempt to assimilate the old rites with later philosophies and put a new face upon religion. He presented a version of the universal ancient theology. What Orpheus delivered in arcane allegories, Pythagoras learned when he was initiated into the mysteries, and Plato next received the knowledge of them from Orphic and Pythagorean writings. He took the primitive uni of religions and philosophies for his point of beginning. Proclus, the most learned and systematic of the Neoplatonists, elaborated the entire theosophy and theurgy into a complete system. Like the rabbis and the Gnostics, he cherished a profound reverence for the abraxas, the word or venerable name, and in overcoming the mundane life, which rendered the individual an organ of divinity. In North America, the syncretistic ground was initially opened up by the anticipated transcendentalist Bible of Nations, and was sowed with the works of T.W. Higginson and Lydia Maria Child. This was like early American comparative religion, which of course became very popular in the 20th century. In a way, the roots of it, okay. Lydia Marie Child actually wrote a novel, Philothea, kind of fun work, an reflective Platonic novel of classical Athens, wherein the protagonist's fiancé ascends to the Platonic forms. Okay? And she also wrote an influential work, The Progress of Religious Ideas Through Successive Ages. And she became Wilder's guru in the field. Okay. The eclectic theosophers, disciples of Ammonius, Saccas, Plotinus Mysterius, Guru Wilde dubbed Philolethians, lovers of truth, and analogetists, interpreters of rites and myths by analogy and correspondence, relating events in the external world to states of the soul. Pagans and Christians alike adopted these doctrines, and a general fusion of religious belief seemed imminent. This is at one point in late antiquity. This is before Constantine. Okay. Wilder says accurately that the Emperor Alexander Severus, which would be in the 230s, Plotinus was young at the time. It was also a very turbulent centuries. Alexander Severus famously kept in his ritual tent busts of Moses, Jesus, Apollonius of Tyana, and Pythagoras. The spectator of the mysteries, according to A.W., receives in Lucis the revelations of a mystic know thee salton, know thyself. Knowledge of the self becomes knowledge of the absolute. He defines entheism as participation in the divine nature, together with prophetic illumination and inspiration, which modern physicians, and remember, Wilder was an MD, right? But he says about this, which modern physicians consider pathological, quote unquote, because of their limited materialist point of view. The individual sublunary personality is fragmented, differentiated rather than integral, contingent to our earthly existence. But intuition is a Platonic anamnesis that brings to consciousness what we knew before coming into the region of limit and change. You know, Plato's idea that the soul remembers its previous incarnations and life among the forms and divine beings. Soul is given form by intellect and gives form to body in turn. The conjunction of soul with mind, which exceeds it, produces understanding. But the intuitive faculty represents the pure noetic, episteme, that same faculty at the top of Plato's divided line in the Republic means overstanding. Okay. And the part of soul pervaded by mind is eternal, a phrase reminiscent of Emerson's oversoul. A.W. praised Jamblichus for his piety and Proclus for his serene temper. And of course, A.W. also translated Jamblichus and other Neoplatonic authors into Platonists. He connects Neoplatonic ecstasy with transcendentalism. We begin with instinct, the end is omniscience, so that transported out of himself, so to speak, he thinks thoughts, views things from their highest point of view, and to use an expression of Emerson's, becomes recipient of the soul of the world. The convert to Neoplatonism from evangelical Christianity had arrived at Platonic enthusiasm, a term originally attributed to Leibniz, the kind of enthusiasm which is also rational and not just what we would see as sort of wild fundamentalism or whatever term you want to use. He understood that Jamblichus added theurgy to the eclectic's theosophy. In Plotinus, gnosis, the soul proceeds philosophically, first by means of sense perception, secondly, discursive dialectics, and thirdly, by noetic intuition. Its instinct is to return to its origin, which its higher part never left. Its center, the eternal good, through a faculty superior to reason. Jamblichus, on the other hand, proceeds theurgically. In contemplating the blessed spectacles, acquires another life and operates according to another energy. In late antiquity and Renaissance, the Platonic school depended upon some sort of respected domestic spiritual tradition to which they could attach their doctrines as an esoteric interpretation. In late antiquity, Julian could employ Jamblichian theurgy to sort of revalorize all the cult's rites and mysteries for the creation of his quasi-Byzantine Hellenic counterchurch. Christianity had its Proclus, Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite. The Universalists of the Renaissance remained Christians and or Jews, such as Leone Abreu. Thomas Taylor's hope of replacing the established church with theurgic Neoplatonism was far-fetched. Emerson seems to have understood this, despite his quip that reading Jamblichus in the churches would bring about a revival, and his recognition that they of the old religion, the great Neoplatonists, the Trismegisti, made the early Christians seem parvenus and popular. The 15th century prophecy of Gemistus Pleton that Christianity and Islam would disappear and that they would subsequently be replaced by a new purified Hellenic theology was not really a coherent idea or possibility in the late 19th century, if it ever was. After the initial romantic impact of transcendentalism faded and the hope of a new American spiritual horizon with endless Whitman-esque possibilities faded, the choices once again seemed to narrow down to materialism and atheism or agnosticism versus a specific traditional religion. There was no esotericism. What I mean by that is, for example, in Islam, you have ecstatic Sufism, and, you have Sufi orders which practice certain rituals, but then you can have an esoteric interpretation. So that's what I mean by esotericism. And in Islam, of course, that made it possible for the Illuminationists to actually conduct a Neoplatonic revival. And so, with that lacking for the spiritual basis and energy, at least it probably seemed to them, like it or not, the only opinion in this context was for AWTMJ Theosophy, conceived as a new universal umbrella for all traditions in the future. The spiritual evolution of humankind called for a new world church. Hopefully this would provide that exoteric esotericism for the Neoplatonic project. Okay, so of course, we've heard a lot about occult today, and A.W. actually wrote a lot of the Neoplatonic sections of Blavatsky's Isis Unveiled. And maybe he shied away later, but I'm just assuming this must have seemed like a way to go, so that there'd be something in the Platonic philosophy could have some kind of institutional basis. Okay. Essentially, there was a religious crisis at the time. Okay, TMJ focused much of his thought on systematic and logical elements of Proclus, because Proclus is a very logical mind. Published fragments of a poem attributed to Proclus for the sake of the philosophic reader, to whom nothing concerning Proclus is without interest. And the elements of theology as theological institutes first made its appearance serially in the Platonist, translated by TMJ as a handbook of elementary principles of Platonic theology. Okay, and subsequently in 1909, a revised edition in book form came out as Proclus Metaphysical Elements, dedicated to W.C.T. Harris, the St. Louis Hegelian, who has battled for God, freedom, and immortality against sottish atheists. Okay. After financial considerations put an end to the Neoplatonic periodicals, the Platonist and then Bibliotheca Platonica, which was its successor, TMJ basically disappeared for 17 years. Then in 1907, he emerged with translation of Jamblich's Exhortation to Philosophy. There's a nice volume of that by Fanny's Press, which my friend David Farley used to run some time ago. It was actually an introduction by Jocelyn Johnson. So, okay. Next, Osceola Platonica, and then 1909, the Metaphysical Elements, and his version of Elements of Theology. Three fundamental ideas of the human mind, or principles of the human mind, in the Osceola is an account of our innate knowledge of God, freedom, and immortality. And TMJ leans on the authority of Plato and the Platonic tradition to make his case. 2 points here, however, are worthy of attention. Following Hermaeus' Platonic demonstration of the immortality of the soul from his commentary on the Phaedrus, the essential self-activity of the soul is a basis for immortality. The term self-active is the exact equivalent of the Greek autokinetos. In TMJ's estimation, the chief contemporary exponent of self-activity was the Hegelian W.T. Harris. A self-active soul would also be self-determined. It is not determined by another, hence metaphysically self-subsistent. Secondly, bases his argument on the notion that the idea of deity is fundamental to the human mind. And he quotes a famous passage in Jamblichus on the Mysteries, in which Jamblichus claims a priori knowledge of the gods' existence is co-essential to us prior to judgment and demonstration. Thus it is wrong to say with Porphyry, it must be granted there are gods, as if it might not be granted. Okay, Johnson, TMJ, also translated Proclus' commentary on the Chaldean oracles is also included in this volume. A work intended to fill the soul with divine fire and bring it into contact with the One, anagogically, through ineffable systems and invisible hymns. His rendering of On the Chaldean Philosophy indicates a fine sense of the levels of Procline mystical union, first with the flower of the intellect, which being intellectual is apprehended by the paternal intellect, that's like the news of Plotinus, according to its unity, or Hanad, but the flower of the whole soul leads us, since everything we are is more than intellect, leads us to the principle which is beyond all beings and is the unifying power of all that is in us. And by the way, TMJ's translation has been recently used in an edition of Platonic and Pythagorean selections by no less of a Theurgic Neoplatonist than our friend, the late Algisus Davenis. It should also be said that his translation of Iamblichus' exhortation remains useful to this day. Okay, so then in the early 20th century, TMJ continued to translate Iamblichus and Proclus and engage in polemic with the anti-Platonist, as he put it, Paul Shorey, at the University of Chicago. Shorey's students wrote on the history of Platonism, and Ronald Levinson was one of them. Levinson actually knew some of the American Neoplatonists at the Plato Club, founded by the Platonist Hiram K. Jones in Jacksonville, Illinois. For example, Louis J. Block, who read a poem there on November 7th, 1890, Plato's birthday, and here's his poem, Proclus the dreamer high sought thee, that is Plato, beyond the sky, to fathom thy deepest speech contains, what thy deepest speech contains. Plotinus into thee swooned in his ecstasy, being wrapped unto the far imperial plains. Also, TMJ read his paper, The Debt of the Moderns to Plato, and one Vanby Whisker read Proclus' Hymn to the Muses. Olympiodorus famously divided late antique Neoplatonists into two groups. Those like Plotinus and Porphyry who put philosophy before theurgy, and those like Iamblichus, Syrianus, and Proclus who put theurgy before philosophy. And TMJ believed that the Platonic philosophy came to mankind for the benefit of terrestrial souls in place of statues, temples, and the whole of sacred institutions, and that it is the leader of salvation alike to the men that now are and those who shall come thereafter. Johnson was aware of theosophical syncretism, and that it included esoteric Christianity, but for his part he remained an interpreter of Theurgic Neoplatonism. TMJ and AW do not exactly fit Olympiodorus' classification, rather than a difference of emphasis. Proclus attempted all religions theurgically, as it were, save one, and he practiced the rites which were part of philosophy. And so, what that favorite saying of his, you have to understand that not that the rites went away, but they were revalorized by theurgy and Neoplatonism. Okay? And so Johnson was a Procline Neoplatonist, perhaps a practicing theurgist, and hence his continuing interest in some of these occult things, whereas A.W. was a mystagogue syncretist and more of a theoretical, was searching for a theoretical basis for a universal religion with a wide scope, as was usual for modern Platonists since the Renaissance. I guess I'm a little overtime, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
and if there's any question about Dr. Bregman's presentation, that you're welcome to ask them now or save them for later if there's something that has to do with comparative study.
I have a question. First, a comment about these wonderful coincidences. Your book came out while we were working on Letters to the Sage. We had no idea it was in the works. The same year, the entire collected writings of Alexander Wilder in 4 volumes appeared in print. So it's like the 2 stars of our collection suddenly are in print again for the first time in a very long time. So can you tell us anything about how that book came about?
Okay, now which one are you talking about?
Your collection of TMJ's collection.
Oh, okay, that's Tim Addy.
But you're right, you did the introduction.
Tim asked me to do the introduction. And the Prometheus Trust is reprinting as much as possible of Neoplatonic literature of all sorts. And Tim Addy believes in it. So basically that's what it is. It's his project. And he's been interested in TMJ for a long time also. I think he would have liked to come here. I know he wants to visit. He's told me.
Right.
Okay, but actually the Prometheus Trust is, they have a conference every year in the UK. It's worth going to. It's a nice scene. But that's just Neoplatonic. Maybe it's Theurgic.
So maybe next year on November the 7th we're going to meet in England.
Yeah, maybe. Why not? It's Plato's birthday.